Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the cryptoverse. Today we're going to talk about Bitcoin, and we're going to be looking at our ROI or return on investment bands. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the Telegram channel, which you can find a link to in the description below. Let's go ahead and jump in. So this chart, it's actually a fairly interesting chart. It's aesthetically pleasing as well. But what it is we have two y-axes. The primary y-axis on the left is the price of Bitcoin on a logarithmic scale. So for instance, 10 to the 0 is 1. So this would represent the price of $1 for each Bitcoin. This will be 10 cents. This will be $10, $100, $1,000, $10,000, and $100,000. You can see so far we've made it up to around $64,000, $65,000. On the secondary y-axis, we have the ROI time in days. And this represents a 2x. Okay, so these yellow lines represent the amount of days you would have to wait if you bought Bitcoin on that day to realize a 2x return on your investment. What you'll notice is that the amount of, as time goes on, the ROI bands are flattening out a little bit, okay? You can see that over here, they're fairly vertical for these 2x for a 2x ROI. As you get into the next cycle, the slope tends to not be quite as steep, and then so on and so forth, okay? And the reason is because, well, it takes longer. It takes longer to realize a 2x in each cycle. Okay, you can see it's generally taking longer, but you also get more than one 2x band in a cycle. Okay, so when you look here, I mean, some of these, like if you bought Bitcoin at this point, it would have only taken you maybe a few hundred days to see a 2x on your investment. But if you bought it, say right here, it would have only taken you maybe about like 15 days or so. And so a lot of times when you get to that point, it can be a pretty good indication that things are getting relatively heated if you're looking at a 2x in the price of Bitcoin in 2 or 3 weeks, okay? What you'll notice as well is that so far each market cycle, the amount of time that it took to 2x at any point during the cycle has been going up. Okay, so over here in this first cycle, it only took a few days at some points to see a 2x. In the next cycle, it took closer to around 10 days or so, maybe a little bit less. In the following cycle, we saw it get down to as low as just over 10 days, maybe 12 or 13 days. Remember, if you're thinking these grid lines look kind of weird, the grid lines correspond to the primary y-axis, not the secondary y-axis. And then in this cycle so far, you can see that it actually took maybe just over the lowest, or the quickest we saw 2x was over here in just over 20 days or so to see a 2x on the price of Bitcoin. Now, you might say, well, Ben, this is not true, because remember back in March of 2020? Well, again, this is just daily data. We're not taking into account Wix when it went to $3,800 for like a second, and it was back above $5,000 before the daily close. We're just looking at daily closes over the entire lifespan of Bitcoin. And so I look at this chart and I would speculate that we're going to have other 2x ROI bands before we get, say, a prolonged bear market. Now, we could always have an intermediate. If you want to call it bear market, you can. If you want to call it consolidation phase, if you want to call it reaccumulation phase, whatever you want to call it, but maybe something that looks like, the second half of 2019. I think that's relatively normal. But what it does show is that, again, over time, these ROI bands are starting to flatten out. You can see it's starting to flatten out, and they're not quite as steep as they were once upon a time. Now, you might be interested, well, what does it look like for other types of ROI bands? What about more than 2x? Because most people who are in Bitcoin aren't going to get out of bed for a 2x return on their investment. This one shows, 2x, 4x, 6x, 8x, 10x, 20x, 50x, and 100x. There's obviously a lot going on in this chart. It's hard to see what's going on. So let's maybe try to break it down a little bit for you. So the purple that you hardly see any of it, right? That would represent a 100x at the very top. So you could have seen a 100x, okay? You could have experienced a 100x even if you had bought just last market cycle back in, say, 2016, because we know the price was around $600. We know we just went to $60,000. So in about 5 years or so, Bitcoin was able to do a 100x. So we know it's still possible. Of course, it's going to take longer and longer, but it is still possible. I really like this chart because it shows you not only the 2x, but it's also aesthetically pleasing looking at the higher return on investments as well. The light blue represents a 4x, so you can see they all behave in very similar manners, but it also visually shows us how each cycle is, the return is diminishing from one cycle to another. I see a lot of people say things like, diminishing returns is ridiculous and that it doesn't make any sense. But if you just look at the ROI of any prior cycle and try to argue against diminishing returns, then that's not an argument I would want to be on the side of, because you simply cannot defend it. You simply cannot defend that returns. They've definitely diminished. Again, we've shown charts before that showed that if we weren't experiencing diminishing returns, at least by the first or second cycle standards, we would have already been over $1 or $2 million at this point in the cycle. But we're not. The main one that we're still sort of on pace with is cycle 3. But again, I'm speculating that we ultimately will not be able to keep pace with cycle 3, and the cycle 4 will ultimately put in a diminished return and lengthened cycle. And I think it's fairly evident from these charts as well. When you look at the amount of time it takes to double up on your investment or quadruple or 10x, etc., you see the same stuff buried in the data, that these moves are flattening out. Macro level volatility is decreasing. A lot of people don't understand what that means because they're like, well, there's been a lot more intra-cycle volatility. There has, but when you look at, say, like the difference over the macro scale between, say, the minimum and maximum price in a given year, it is decreasing over time. And we'll maybe show that in a future video. We've shown it before, but for new people, we'll show it in a future video. But you also look at this and you can see that the amount of time that it takes to see like a few X multiple, it is increasing. Okay, it is increasing from one cycle to another. I mean, like, let's look at these purple bands. You can see that over here it was around 100 days, then over here it was a few hundred days to see that return, and then almost 1,000 days, and then this one was over 1,000 days. So we're sort of seeing these long-term diminishing returns play out, but in any given week or month, it can seem like they're not. But then when you take a step back, you're like, oh yeah, it's still doing the same thing, the same thing that we would have speculated. For instance, I mean, if you look at the 4x ROI, the light blue, you can see that at one point back in 2011, we were able to see a 4x in about 10 days. But then as we get on, you can see this was about 20 days or so at the peaks. Note that this was a double peak cycle, so we had two distinct bands. I'm sort of hoping we get two distinct bands over here as well. But then this one took about 20, and then over here it took closer to maybe 40 or 50. This one was around 100. So you are seeing things play out like we might expect, but when you're living through it, it might seem like it's not doing exactly what you think. But again, when you take a step back, look at the whole cycle, the trend has stayed the same. Okay, the trend has stayed the same. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the Telegram channel, which you can find a link to in the description below. Remember to check out the premium list. You can find a link to that in the description below as well. And we also do have some t-shirts at store.intothe.cryptoverse.com. Thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe, click the bell icon to turn on your alerts, and I'll see you next time. Bye.